Okay, so we'll just wait for the last few people to come in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so welcome everybody to another edition of eoPERCS. Today we have Chris Lowery from the University of Texas in the US, and he'll be talking about the Mid-Cretaceous Oceanic Anoxic Event 2 on the North American coastal plain. So the format of today's seminar, so we'll have welcome and announcements for around 5 minutes, followed by Chris's talk, followed by a moderated Q&A, and then an after-talk tea time with our speaker, which we very much encourage you to stick around for. So don't forget to send your questions via the chat to the questions at eoPERCS host, who today is Chrissy. So we've got a bit of housekeeping. So eoPERCS values the participation of everyone interested in paleosciences, and we remind you to please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. So if you've somehow found yourself here today without having signed this, please take a moment to go to our website and have a quick look at this. Please remember to mute yourself for the duration of the talk. You shouldn't be able to unmute yourself, but if you find you can, please don't. And just a second reminder that you can ask questions by chatting to the questions host, and any technical issues should also go to our questions host as well. We now have closed captions built into Zoom, and you can use the CC button to show or hide them. You can also nominate all your most outstanding and amazing friends and colleagues who are ECRs via the link on our page, on the slide. So we do have a SurveyMonkey link, which will be in the chat window at the end of the talk. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. So we have Chris Lowery. He did his bachelor's in geology at the University of Mary Washington in the US, followed by a master's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, followed by his PhD in the same institution, followed at the Institute for Geophysics at the University of Texas. And he's currently at the University of Texas, Austin, as a research associate in the Institute for Geophysics and a lecturer in the Department of Geological Sciences. And now I will hand over to Chris to start his talk.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for having me. Let's see. I think I still need to, right?
You should be able to.
Oh, I got it. Sorry. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Yes. Thank you all for having me. I'm glad to be able to participate in this. It's been so nice. Like it's been rough not being able to go to in-person meetings and see people, but it's also cool to be able to give these lectures and see other people's lectures from across the world that we normally wouldn't get to see. And so I really appreciate the organizers for putting this whole series together and for inviting me to participate in it. So today I'm going to talk about the Mid-Cretaceous Oceanic Anoxic Event 2 on the North American coastal plain. So a lot of our records of OAE2 come from the deep sea. A lot of them come from the western interior. But the coastal plain continental margins are actually really important environments as well. In the modern ocean, most organic matter is buried on continental margins. Probably was also true in the Sediment and Trigonous. And yet these are some of the places that we have the least amount of records for. And we'll talk about all that in a minute, but I think it's really important to kind of build these records out to better understand what's going on in these marginal environments. And so that's been kind of a side project of mine, basically, that's come out of my PhD work, and I've been following through ever since. We just had a paper accepted in Climate of the Past, looking at a few cores from North Carolina. And this seemed like a good opportunity in this talk to step back and say, okay, well, we've got here's all these new cores we've found over the last few years. What is this telling us about OAE2 on the coastal plain, specifically of North America? And what are the next questions that we can ask as a community? This just isn't just me looking for more cores in Louisiana or whatever. I think that these are things that are important overall for the study of OAEs, and hopefully we can move in this direction together. I want to acknowledge a lot of people who contributed to different parts of this work, in particular Gene Selftrail and Craig Berry, who are co-authors on this Climate of the Past paper that was just accepted. Gene Selftrails with USGS, and some of these cores we looked at are USGS cores. Also want to acknowledge Tim Braylauer, Jeremy Owens, Mark Leckie, who's my PhD advisor, who contributed to different parts of this work as well. Before we get started with the science part, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. This is particularly important because some of this work I did before I knew about land acknowledgements and why they're important. So this is actually kind of a nice opportunity to swing back and cover those things that I didn't know about before. So I just kind of want to start with, looking only at the places that I've worked on, the sites we're going to talk about here. But in Rock Canyon, Colorado, the Sediment global stratotype section in Point is on land that is the ancestral unceded land of the Hickory, Apache, Cheyenne, and Ute. In West Texas, Lozier Canyon is on the land of the Kickapoo, Jumanos, Coahuiltecan, and Mescalero Apache. Baskin Core down in Webb County is on the land, unceded land of the Coahuiltecan people. Where I'm presenting from in Austin, Texas, is ancestral lands of the Jumanos, Tonkawa, Coahuiltecan, and Comanche. The Sphinx Core in southern Mississippi is part of the ancestral lands of the Choctaw. And then the Hope Plantation and Smith Elementary School cores in North Carolina are part of the lands of the Tuscarora, Secotan, Chowanoke, Pamlico, and Moratock peoples. Also, Hope Plantation was that kind of plantation from 1748 to 1865. Slaves were held there, or people were held there as slaves, up to 200 people at a time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well. All of this stuff, I think, actually is really important to acknowledge. When geologists do a lot of work on the land, and it's important for us to acknowledge the peoples who were displaced from that land or who were displaced onto that land that we study. The field of geology is part of the broader system that drove those displacements and the extraction of resources and the search for land out west and across the U.S. And acknowledging that, I think, is a really small but important step in thinking about how our field can be more just in the future and not contribute to those sort of things moving forward. And there's no way to easily segue from that to science. But anyway, so to kind of give you some broad background here, Oceanic and Anoxic events are some of the most important paleoceanographic events of the Cretaceous. This is a figure from Leckie et al. 2002 showing age from the Turonian back to the Barremanian. And there are several of these periods of time of enhanced burial of organic carbon in the marine realm. And this is associated with the widespread deposition of black shales and the widespread development of oceanic anoxia. That's important to point out. We talk about widespread. It wasn't everywhere. The entire ocean wasn't anoxic, and the entire ocean wasn't black shales during OAEs. Some estimates, I think, have it like 13% of the total ocean at the worst part of the worst OAE was anoxic. Of course, leaves 87% not anoxic. But these are still very widespread events. The timing of anoxia, the timing of black shale deposition can vary from site to site. Those are controlled by local processes. And as you'll see, they don't necessarily line up with the global event. And the global event is best defined by a positive carbon isotope excursion. So if you bury a lot of isotopically negative organic carbon, what's left behind is enriched, more positive organic carbon, so you get this positive excursion. You can see this through time, OAE1A, OAE1B, several events down here. This dark gray is organic carbon, this light gray is carbonate carbon isotopes through time. Some smaller events, but the biggest ones are OAE1A and OAE2, the Sediment-Turonian boundary, which we'll be talking about today. Most associated with sea level rise, and all of them were associated with the emplacement of large igneous provinces, which is probably the main driver of OAEs. Case of OAE2, you have volcanic outgassing of the Caribbean large igneous province. This put a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which caused warming. This warming caused a stronger hydrologic cycle. Stronger hydrologic cycle caused increased continental weathering, which caused increased nutrient flux into the oceans, which caused higher productivity. There's a lot of isotopic evidence for a global increase in weathering flux from the continents to the oceans at this time. Once you start kicking off this higher productivity in the open ocean, you have a lot of biogeochemical feedbacks that sustain it and amplify it. But probably the fundamental driver here is the large igneous provinces. When we think about a typical oceanic anoxic event, site like in a stratigraphic section, most of us, myself included, probably picture like the Bonarelli level in Italy, right? This kind of beautiful black shale. You have this nice pelagic deep sea carbonate. OAE2 starts, boom, black shale deposition, positive carbon isotope excursion, high TOC, OAE2 ends, and you're back to your nice, beautiful white pelagic limestone. Or maybe you think about a place like Demerara Rise in the equatorial Atlantic, where you have really high productivity in the ocean before, during, and after OAE2. So it's just black shales all the way throughout, with a positive carbon isotope excursion being the only thing in the overall black shale succession that shows you where OAE2 is. But the deep sea, not the only environment in the world, right? As we talked about in the my intro slide, spoiler alert, continental margins are really important for this as well. And in the Cretaceous as well, there are a lot of epicontinental seaways, in particular, the Cretaceous Western Interior Sea in North America. And so a nice example of how, OAE2 doesn't have a quote unquote typical expression, really, if you look at the rock record, is from the Sediment Turonian global stratotype section in Point in Pueblo, Colorado. Here you have this nice Heartland shale, which is organic rich, it's anoxic, overlaid by this beautiful white limestone of the Bridge Creek limestone, which is not organic rich, it's not anoxic, and yet OAE2 starts right here at this prominent limestone bed at the top of the Heartland and continues through the Bridge Creek. As you can see on this carbon isotope record right here, hopefully y'all can see my mouse, but we've got this onset of OAE2 right here at the base of bed 63, and you've got OAE2 in this oxygenated limestone. And we know that this is fairly well oxygenated because we can look at forams. We can also look at burrows. People have looked at burrows quite a bit in some of these rocks, but in today's talk, we're going to talk mostly about foraminifera. Benthic foraminifera track seafloor oxygenation. They track a lot of things. They track sea level, they track nutrient supply, salinity, things like that. If you can hold those other things steady, which we can, and I don't have time in a 30-minute talk to kind of go through for each of these sites why we're sure we can hold those things steady. So if you have questions about that, ask me later. I'm happy to talk about it, just for the sake of time. I'm not going to go over that for each site right now, but if we can hold those other things steady, then we can assume that the percentage of benthic foraminifera at a site corresponds to the amount of oxygen that's available to seafloor at that time. So if you have a well-oxygenated seafloor, you have a lot of benthics. They're diverse. You have benthics living on the seafloor, benthics living below the seafloor. You have low oxygen, diversity declines, benthic abundance declines generally. I know there's definitely a lot of exceptions to this, but generally. And as you get to more anoxic sediments, maybe you have one species of benthic foram that dominates, or maybe you have no benthic forams at all. And so when we look at these records in the Western Interior, this is from a paper by my colleague Khalifa Elderbach and others from UMass, looking at benthic forams across the same section in Rock Canyon, the CT, the Sediment-Turonian GSSP, and they found no benthics down here in the Heartland Shale, or very, very few benthics, and then a big increase in benthics right here at the base of bed 63, onset of OAE2. This was such a striking feature that the first people that described this in the Western Interior Seaway named it the benthonic zone, because there were no benthics and suddenly there were benthics and they were everywhere. And this is, a major change, and this is kind of backwards from how a lot of us think about OAE2 as being like, oh, it's where black shale and anoxia started. But in the Western Interior Seaway, it's where you switch from black shale and anoxia to well-oxygenated limestone. Part of the reason for that in the Western Interior is that, the Western Interior is a unique environment, right? There's this big eoPERCS sea that connected the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. It was probably characterized by estuarine circulation. You get this big, salty, warm, oxygen-poor, carbonate-rich water mass coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of Tethyan affinity fossils in there. You get this cool, brackish, oxygen-rich, and carbonate-poor water mass coming down from the Arctic. A lot of boreal affinity biota, and those kind of swirl around and then mix here in the west, in the central part of the Western Interior. The Western Interior itself was a foreland basin. You've got the deepest water probably over here in the central part of the seaway, but the deepest, thickest sediments over to the west, where you've got this active foreland basin subsiding. You've got the most accommodation over there. But generally, you go from siliciclastic sediments to pelagic, limestones and hemipelagic limestones over this way, to the east. So this all kind of drives changes in the Western Interior Seaway. And the cool thing about the Western Interior, there's a lot of cool things about the Western Interior. I did my PhD on it, so it always will have a special place in my heart. But probably the best thing about it is it has been studied to death. Over 100 years worth of research has been done on the Western Interior. This is a map of all the sites with mid-Cretaceous foram populations, mid to late Cretaceous. So this actually spans a bit beyond OEE2 in this figure, but these are all the different sites across the whole seaway where we have foram population data in the late Cretaceous. So we have this amazing resource we can actually look at, reconstruct changes in really high detail across the seaway. This is something that I did along with a lot of colleagues. The paper was published in Earth Science Reviews in 2018. And what we did is we used benthic foraminifera as a proxy for seafloor oxygenation. And what we found is you have a lot of places, particularly before OEE2, probably hard for you to read these, but the colors are, the dark red is no benthic forams. The warmer colors are few benthic forams, and the cooler colors are lots of benthic forams. So broadly, we're showing, this is changes in foram abundance, but it is also tracking bottom water oxygen, particularly in places where there's zero benthic foram. And in the Harlan Shale before OEE2, we have, particularly in the Central Seaway, no benthic forams and oxic bottom waters, with some oxic bottom waters up here to the north with the boreal waters coming south. As sea level rises, as OEE2 begins, there's a big sea level high stand in the early Trionian. So OEE2 is a period of time of rising sea level. And the sea level rises as OEE2 is about to begin, and as OEE2 begins, you're bringing a lot more water of these northern and southern water masses into the seaway, which are mixing and aerating the whole seaway. So you get an increase in benthic foram abundance across the whole seaway during OEE2. As you move into the Trionian, sea level peaks, and then it begins to decline again. And as sea level declines, you have reduced that water mass mixing, and you start to get anoxia developing, particularly on the eastern side of the seaway. And if you kind of kept running this forward into the Niobrara cycle, which is outside of the scope of our story here, but you go back to a situation where there's almost no benthic forams through much of the seaway at the subsequent low stand. So in the Western Interior, benthic or bottom water oxygenation is overall controlled by sea level. Sea level is high, there's lots of mixing, bottom waters are oxygenated. Sea level is low, and less mixing, you get stagnant waters and anoxia. That's great. That's really cool. We can say so much about that. But that's just the Western Interior Sea, which, as we said, is a kind of a unique environment and is not indicative of the overall global ocean at all. So what's beyond the Western Interior? This is from a figure by Jeremy Owens, a great paper by Jeremy Owens and others, including me. Jeremy did almost all the work on this paper. He made the maps, he did the math, came up with all the spreadsheets. I came in at the 11th hour to provide some data from the Western Interior, and Jeremy very kindly made me a co-author on the paper. But this is really his work, and I think it's a really cool paper, and I want to make sure he gets credit for how cool it is. And I'm just kind of, in this one, I'm kind of just writing his coattails. Excuse me. But these dots are places where there is a OEE2 carbon isotope excursion or record that's been published. And as you can see, our records skew very strongly to the Western Tethys and the Western Interior Seaway, and also particularly the deep water north of Canada. Even these dots that are on the margins here, that's Bass River, that's on land. But these other sites, it's Blake Nose, that's 1,000 meters water depth, which of course is not 5,000 meters water depth, but it's still like open ocean, deep water, right? And so what Jeremy did in this paper was calculate organic carbon mass accumulation rates for OEE2 for the whole ocean. So the one thing that he didn't know in a lot of these papers, nobody measures bulk rock density when they take OEE2 samples. Why would you? You weren't on an IODP cruise. And so he had to estimate average bulk density for these rocks based on general, average values for carbonate siliciclastic rock. He had to find sites that had measured TOC within OEE2, and then he derived the SED rate from just the known duration of the carbon isotope excursion. So everywhere that you have a complete carbon isotope excursion, then the age of the duration that those sediments were deposited, you calculate a sedimentation. And what he found was this, and this is what some extrapolation from sites winds up covering about 13% of the total global ocean, which is crazy. This is one of the best studied events of the Phanerozoic. It's certainly the best studied event of the Cretaceous, I would argue. I haven't done the math on that, but I'm almost sure that it would turn out to be the best studied oceanographic event of the Cretaceous. And yet we can only say something about 13% of the seafloor. And that's even with extrapolation. Like in some places, kind of severe extrapolation. Like here's one side in Eastern Australia, here's one side in Western Australia. And, it's reasonable probably to extrapolate up and down the coast, especially in the absence of other data. But even then, like there's still a lot that we could fill in here. And of course, there's a lot of oceanic crust that's since been subducted since the Turonian that we're never going to get. But what I want to focus on here is the eastern coast of North America. Again, the Western Interior, we nailed it. We've got a lot of data up there. We're doing good in the Western Interior. But then if you look, we got one data point here in Texas. We swing around. This is Lake Nose, which again is like 1,000 meters water depth. I don't think it necessarily really counts as a continental margin. And then we've got Bass River up here in New Jersey, and that's it, the whole eastern U.S. And we know that these rocks are there, so what's going on? And again, this is a really important place to look because as I mentioned before, most organic carbon burial in the ocean today occurs on continental margins. And so understanding organic carbon burial on Sedimanian and Turonian continental margins is really key for understanding the overall processes that drove OAE2. So we've got nice records. Here's a few. This is not all the sites, as you know, from the Western Interior, but here's a few. The other part of my PhD work back at UMass was looking at Texas and looking at the OAE2 record from Texas. And what we find is if we look at Lozier Canyon out in West Texas, if we look at Boulden Creek here in Austin, we see things that are very similar to Western Interior, whereas we look to South Texas, we see something very different. And what this looks like, here's some sections. This is Lozier Canyon. This is the Fasken Core in South Texas. So here's a stratigraphic section with a gamma ray profile, very characteristic gamma ray profile of the lower Eagleford Shale here. We have organic carbon isotopes, carbonate carbon isotopes, total organic carbon, percent benthic foraminifera. The black is total benthic foraminifera, the light gray faunal benthic foraminifera, and the dashed line is benthic foram simple diversity. So just number of species, nothing fancy. As we can see down here in the lower Eagleford Shale, this is organic rich, very organic rich in the lower part of the lower Eagleford, but organic rich throughout. No benthic foraminifera, no burrows, no anything. It was an anoxic seafloor through most of this period of time. Right here, right near a very prominent limestone bed that when you first go to this outcrop, you look at it and go, boy, that sure looks like Rock Canyon. There is an increase in carbon isotopes that indicates the onset of OAE2, just like you see in Rock Canyon. And just like you see in Rock Canyon, TOC declines, benthic forams appear, become more abundant and diverse. Benthic forams appear down here before, and they don't really increase in abundance till up here, but their diversity does go up through that interval. And so it looks just like the benthonic zone. So this is very clearly a Western Interior affinity site out here in West Texas. In South Texas, we see something completely different. Here's a gamma ray profile, again, with this nice big positive high gamma lower Eagleford bit that you can see very clearly all through the subsurface. Carbonate carbon isotopes at kind of a lower resolution. This was an oil industry core, and they very kindly shared the samples with us. And they were like, all right, we got high resolution samples for you guys. Here they come. You're going to love it. We're like, awesome. That's great. High resolution. And it was samples every 10 feet. So different definitions of high resolution, but it's great. We're still able to see OAE2 on this record. But there's no benthic forams at all anywhere in this core. I shouldn't say, so there's a few, but they're obviously reworked. They're shallow shelf things that occur in layers with sand, which suggests to me that they're reworked. There's no in situ benthic forams through this core. TOC is high before OAE2, during OAE2, after OAE2. This is very, very different. And what's going on here is driven by the structure of Central Texas platform at this time. So there's this big carbonate platform, early Cretaceous carbonate platform. These sediments are all draped over. Shallow water. So here in West Texas at Lozier Canyon, and also some sites on the platform out at Big Bend, in the Big Bend area in West Texas, you have a very similar, Western Interior affinity OAE2 going on. But down here to the east, where the Swift-Fasken core is, you're off of that platform. You're off of this relict Albion reef margin at the shelf edge, and you're on what's called the Rio Grande Submarine Plateau, which is between these Appian and Albion reef margins. If you look at a profile, basically it looks like this. Here's Lozier Canyon up here, being all western interior. And here's the Fasken core, which is on this perched little submarine plateau. And what we think is going on here is that this was in an oxygen minimum zone for the duration of the Cretaceous. So you get this OMZ in the deep water that comes up and is just kind of flooding the Fasken core area for the duration of the event before, during, and after. So you get, anoxic bottom waters and organic carbon accumulation for this period of time. This is a mosasaur. You can't tell. Okay, so that was, as I mentioned, that was part of my PhD work, and I came down to Texas to start my postdoc, and I gave that talk and talked about, so now we know, like, okay, this is very similar to Texas, except for the southern, Texas is very similar to the western interior, except for the southern part of the state. But we don't, at the time, there was nothing to the east. Closest OAE2 record, ignoring the Central Texas platform or the Central Mexican carbonate platforms, which are their own thing, you can ask me about later. But to the east, the closest record was Blake Nose, right? There's nothing over here. And I was talking about this, and I was like, I was really curious. I'd like to know, like, we can tie this to the western interior. We tie it across the coastal plain. What's going on over there? There's this formation called the Tuscaloosa. And that should be equivalent. And I, after my talk, I was standing there having coffee, and a guy from the Bureau of Economic Geology walked up to me, and he said, "Hey, we've got a marine Tuscaloosa core in the core repository across the street. Would you like to work on it?" I was like, "Hell yeah, I would, please." And so that just kind of fell in my lap, and that's what kind of pushed me onto this path of, like, what does OE2 look like on the coastal plain? So the Tuscaloosa formation is split up generally into 3 units. You have a lower Tuscaloosa sand that is kind of stacked near shore environments. You get deltaic, strand plain, beach, coastal barrier, lagoonal, up into transgressive sands at the top. Then a nice marine shale, organic rich marine shale that's like open shelf. And then sea level falls again, and you get upper Tuscaloosa shelf and shore face marginal marine sands again. But with this nice little layer of marine stuff in the middle. The Sphinx core that I looked at is right here on the shelf in southern Mississippi, right here. And if we go to the next slide, you can see this is a map of sediment depot centers that basically filled in during the low stand in the Cinnamanian. You get these incised valleys going all the way after the shelf edge. Here's the shelf edge, this line right here, right? Here's the shelf edge. Here's all these valleys that went out with these depot centers, and they pour the sand, off the shelf edge and then into the deep water as well. But here's the Sphinx core, this red star. So we're real close to the shelf edge. And you go further up the shelf, you get the outcrop belts, and the shoreline is even further north from here. So we're just like way out the edge of the shelf with this core. Probably as just about as deep as you can get on the shelf while still being on the shelf. This is the core itself. You get this is the well that they drilled it from. But like the whole Tuscaloosa, there's this very obvious high resistivity interval that's at the base of the marine Tuscaloosa. It's mapped as like 100 different things, by the way. So you'll see middle Tuscaloosa listed a lot and other things as well in different papers. But this marine Tuscaloosa is characterized by this high resistivity unit at the base, high TOC. This is an oil play in some places. And the core got a very nice, almost entire marine Tuscaloosa core recovered, and then just a smidge of the top of the lower Tuscaloosa as well. And if you look at this, I looked at this before I looked at the core. You got, lower Tuscaloosa, and then above that you've got, which is kind of shallower water. And then above that, you've got this high resistivity interval, this marine unit, this high resistivity interval that's probably high TOC, ends about halfway up, and then it goes away. And this looks like the Eagleford, right? It looks like the Eagleford Shale, where you get high resistivity, high TOC at the base, and then OAE2 is somewhere up there. That's what I was guessing before I actually got any data from the core. And I was completely wrong. In fact, it turns out that OAE2 is down here at the top of the lower Tuscaloosa sandstone, the very base of the marine Tuscaloosa. So in Texas, high organic carbon deposition, black shale development, anoxia, and all that occurs before OAE2. Here on southern Mississippi, on the open shelf, anoxia doesn't really come in at all. It's still shallow enough that you get benthic forams throughout, although they get very scarce for a bit there. But you get high TOC development, mostly after OAE2. There's a bit during, but it really peaks towards the end and then maintains high TOC in the early Turonian through the sea level high stand, and just as it starts to turn around. This was very surprising, based on my preconceived notions from the Eagle Ford going into it. And so what's driving this? Well, probably a lot of this is sea level driven. I think this is my hypothesis, anyway. And so, this is a well oxygenated environment. So probably benthic forams are mostly responding to sea level here, particularly in the lower bit where you are in OE2 and it's high TOC. Some of this might be anoxic driven as well. We can discuss that further later if you'd like. But overall, we can see this overall sea level trend of transgression up to a maximum flooding surface in the early Turonian, and then regression after that. These sequences stacked on top of it. And just as an aside, because I think this is the coolest thing, and I have to bring it up whenever I get the excuse to, these parasequences look suspiciously familiar to similar parasequences in equivalent rocks in the Western Interior, on the Utah margin of the Western Interior Sea. This is from a paper by my undergraduate advisor, actually, Neil Tybert, published in 2003. And this is, I should mention that this is benthic foram percentage here, looking at these cycles. This is just based on stratigraphy. So this is not a one-to-one comparison. But if you plot up the cycles the same way, we can still see, kind of a peak maximum flooding here with this peak in benthics, and this lines up. The number of cycles in particular line up very nicely from the Western Interior to the Gulf coastal plain. And you can write off, the Lankovich scale sea level variations of 5 to 10 meters in the Western Interior by saying, well, it's a tectonically active basin. We can't make too much out of that, which is fair. But we see equivalent scale sea level changes on a quiescent margin in the Gulf of Mexico that seem to be equivalent. And how do you explain that at a Milankovitch scale in the Cretaceous when there's definitely no ice? Is a great question that I think we should all ponder. When we're out for a run or in the shower or whatever, just something to think about, something I think about a lot, because there's a lot going on. But anyway, what I think is driving the sea level or the organic carbon changes, though, is sea level rise. So as sea level comes up, here's a cartoon. We can talk about this. So actually, let me explain this first. So this is a cartoon cross-section of the Gulf of Mexico at kind of an angle. So here's southern Mississippi, and here's the deep water, and then we do a right turn back up to Texas over here. But I'm just going to talk about the Mississippi side of this for now. So during the lower Tuscaloosa time and the Cinnamanian, sea level was low. You get incised valleys and sand coming out in the deep water. Sea level rises during OE2, and you get OE2 like carbon isotope excursion recorded and all that because it's sea level's rising. You're getting marine transgression, marine deposition up on the shelf. And then during and after OE2, sea level's continuing to rise to this early Turonian maximum flooding. And that brings this oxygen minimum zone that's in the deep water Gulf of Mexico. It's been burying the Fasken core throughout the whole period the Fasken core was deposited. Bringing that OMZ up onto the shelf. It's bringing oxygen poor and nutrient-rich waters up on the shelf, which promote both higher productivity and better preservation of organic carbon. And then when sea level starts to fall again, then the OMZ, the oxygen minimum zone, recedes, and TOC development subsides on the shelf. So that is my overall hypothesis for what's driving black shale deposition on the shelf of the northern Gulf of Mexico. So that's great. So OE2 in Mississippi is anoxic after OE2. Highest TOC is deposited after OE2. That's great. But what's going on? Let's kind of keep tracing this around. What's going on up here on the East Coast? And so there has been a record published up here from Bass River, New Jersey. This goes back to Bowman and Breelauer in 2005, were the first to publish on this. But this is from a more recent paper by Van Helmond et al. In 2014, looking at increased Trigonous flux at this particular spot during OE2. It's very low TOC here. So this is organic carbon abundance. They don't actually plot TOC, but this is carbon isotopes. They don't actually plot TOC on this graph, but it's very, very low through this whole interval, and it doesn't really change during OE2. This is pretty close to shore. But what they do see is a bunch of markers, geochemical markers, and pollen and diatom markers for increased Trigonous flux. So you see a lot of terrestrial signature polynomorphs during OE2, suggesting higher Trigonous flux at this site. So that's all the way up here in New Jersey. And we recently looked at a couple cores down here in North Carolina. These were both drilled in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, by the U.S. Geological Survey, who were doing a coastal plain aquifer study. And I was talking about this with Jean Selftrail at the USGS a while ago, who was part of that project. And she was like, yeah, we got these OE2 cores. Nobody's looked at them because they did the study. They described the whole core. They did some basic biostrat. But then they had to move on the project. They weren't being funded to look at OE2 in the coastal plain. I don't know why. Obviously that's the most important thing anybody could be doing with their time, looking at OE2 on the coastal plain. But anyway, there's these two cores here that we're able to come back to and sample. This is the Hope Plantation core, which was drilled in 2004. It's Sediment-Turonian. It's inner shelf. There's two overall units you can see here. There's a lower, more marine unit that's got a lot of bivalves and other shallow, inner shelf type features and fossils, nanofossils as well. There's no forams in either of these cores, which is a huge bummer for me. And it's a huge bummer for you because you don't get to hear me talk about forams in these cores. But we're not sure if it was, when it was sitting on the ground for the last 94 million years, or when it was sitting on a shelf in the North Carolina Geological Survey building for the last 15 years. But these are organic-rich sediments. They're sandy. They're very porous. So there's a lot of pore fluid that can move around, which probably really promotes dissolution of forams. My guess is while they were sitting on a shelf over the last 15 years. But Jean was able to find plenty of nanoplankton through here. Not plenty. There's some barren intervals as well, but enough to get good biostrata. So we're confident that these are Sediment-Turonian samples. Anyway, nanos down here. We have an upper, more marginal marine or terrestrial unit that's characterized by no marine fossils, more woody plant debris, mud balls, things like that. Then we have the Smith Elementary School core, which is drilled a year later in 2005. A little bit more distal than the Hope Plantation core. The lower marine interval has a lot more going on, a lot finer grain size, more burrows, some amalgamated shell layers, a lot more bivalve debris, better nanofossil preservation. And then this upper non-marine or very marginal marine unit, again, a lot of woody plant debris, things like that, but also a few shells and burrows worked into it still as well. And when you look at these two cores, you find OE2 very nicely in both of them. In both cases in the lower marine informal unit of the Clubhouse Formation here. I should have mentioned that earlier. It's called the Clubhouse Formation here in North Carolina. So it's Eagleford in Texas, Tuscaloosa in Mississippi, and Clubhouse Formation in North Carolina, if you're keeping track of lithostratigraphic units at home. Anyway, here's the Hope Plantation core. Here's the Smith Elementary School core. We can see organic carbon isotopes, TOC, and carbon-nitrogen ratios for each of these cores. Organic carbon, TOC, carbon-nitrogen. With organic carbon, we see a very nice OE2 excursion in both of these cores with the whole structure, the ABC structure that we all know and love. Little Plenus excursion there in the middle, and it comes back up with this nice long plateau. TOC, not particularly enriched in either core, certainly not compared to before or after. In both of these units, actually, the highest TOC is in this less marine upper interval, probably because of the inclusion of more woody plant debris. You can see these spikes are intervals where we're probably getting little pieces of wood in the sample because higher TOC in discrete intervals. But what's interesting about both of these cores is that if you look at carbon nitrogen, you see this increase in carbon nitrogen ratio in the later part of OE2 in both units. Carbon nitrogen ratio is a proxy for organic matter provenance. So terrestrial plant matter, land plants basically, have a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than algae. Land plants got to spend a lot of molecules and energy building, leaves and stems and bark and all this stuff. And you're not going to use your nutrients for that. You're just going to use carbon. So most of that is made out of carbon, and they save the nutrients for the actual photosynthesizing. Algae are just little blobs of stuff photosynthesizing in the water, and so they have a much higher proportion of nitrogen in their organic matter than land plants. So if you see an increase in carbon to nitrogen ratio in your samples, what that's telling you is there's a higher percentage of terrestrial debris coming out into your study area from the land. And we see that in the later part of OE2 in both of these samples, or both of these cores, beg your pardon, which suggests that like New Jersey, the Bass River record of Van Helmond et al., we're seeing an increase in Trigonous flux in North Carolina and the central coastal plain during particularly the later part of OE2. And that's interesting because we've got these global records of increased Trigonous flux from lithium isotopes and calcium isotopes, great studies on that. But we don't know the local patterns of this Trigonous flux. So almost certainly, even though the global average Trigonous flux increased, almost certainly every single site individually didn't increase. Just like every site isn't a black shale during OE2, there must be some sites where Trigonous flux increased a lot. There must be some places where it didn't change. Probably there's some places where it went down. And if we can map that out, if we can actually look at local changes in Trigonous flux across OEEs, then we can actually say something about precipitation patterns and how that changed during OEEs. And that would be cool as hell. So we really need to be developing more of these Trigonous flux local records that we can look at through here. The other interesting thing about these cores is if you look at the organic carbon content, they're very low. And that's probably because I think they're inner shelf cores, right? They're very close to land. That means that they were, estuary, shore face, shallow marine, which means they were always mixed up by wind and waves and storms. And so it's hard for anoxia to really develop, and it's hard to preserve a lot of organic carbon in those kind of environments. If you normalize the duration of OE2 for all these things, if you look at just plotting the TOC weight percent for each core, you get this nasty spaghetti wiggly plot. But hopefully, if you kind of squint and lean back, you can see that some of these cores have an overall higher percentage of TOC than others. You can also just look at the average percentage TOC for each core. And there's a very clear trend here of cores that are more proximal versus cores that are more distal. Hope Plantation's our most proximal core. It also has the lowest average TOC. Smith School is next, then Bass River. And the Sphinx core, which is all the way on the edge of the shelf, has much higher average TOC as well. And so the hypothesis is that there's a relationship in the distance from shore. I think it's because as sea level rose in the late Cenomanian, bringing that oxygen minimum zone up onto the shelf, the deeper sites got the benefit of that oxygen minimum zone for longer, more nutrients, lower oxygen, higher TOC preservation potential. Whereas the inner shelf sites either didn't get that oxygen minimum zone at all, or they got it for a short enough time that it didn't affect things too much. It's still just the hypothesis, though, because we have this nice, I plotted it up and I say proximal to distal. And look, there's even an arrow. Obviously, this is great. But of course, this is 4 cores spread across 3 states. It's not a real depth transect. What we really need is to find some cores from the same place that go from proximal to distal offshore. So to bring all this together, we've now added 3 brand new shiny Oceanic and Anoxic Event 2 cores on the coastal plain. Actively looking at other cores. There's some folks at University of Louisiana Lafayette that have a couple OE2 cores just offshore of the Sphinx core. I'm working with them to work on those data. Gene and I have found some other cores in North Carolina and Virginia that we're going to look at that aren't as complete across OE2, but definitely will give us some picture. And of course, there's also this exciting core out here on Hatteras Island that I'll talk about in just a second. But to kind of summarize for now, what we've learned, an open ocean OMZ, from the deeper waters where OMZs form, was brought up onto the shelf during late Cenomanian sea level rise. And I think that's what caused the development of TOC, the development of anoxia in these deeper sites, because it brought up all this nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor water, and it drove higher organic carbon burial in the middle and outer shelf. The relationship of sea level rise and OE2 development is not new. Mike Arthur talked about this in the 80s before I was born. There's a long history of this, but we have kind of leaned a lot more towards large igneous provinces as the main driver. Rightfully, there's a lot of evidence that suggests large igneous provinces were a main driver of OEEs. But I think that we need to come back to sea level a little bit and think about how this modulated or affected development as well of anoxia and OEEs in general, particularly on shelf environments, which are places we care about a lot today, because that's where a lot of our seafood comes from. It's very important environmental and economic regions to understand. And as our modern ocean continues to lose oxygen, understanding how the shelves respond to that should be a priority. These results suggest that TOC increases with distance from shore. The data still support that, but we need more cores along a true depth transect to truly test that. Also, more records of OE2 on the shelf will help us to map patterns of locally enhanced Trigonous flux and thus map precipitation changes during this Oceanic Anoxic event during this warmest part of the Cretaceous, and really much better understand the climatological changes that took place at this time as well. And of course, the most important thing here is more cores. If you know of any cores, if you have any cores, if you have any leads on any cores, I would love to know about them. Or if you want to work it up yourself, that would rule too. We just need more data, and I can't do it all. So definitely, let's all of us that work on OEs, let's look for more cores on the coastal plain. As I mentioned, that we're actively looking at some cores. In particular, we're looking at the Hatteras core, which was drilled in the 40s on Hatteras Island. There's the famous Cape Hatteras lighthouse here. Could you imagine today if they put up a huge oil rig right next to the lighthouse? How mad people would be. Anyway, but we got this core back in the day. And this core, so the Hope Plantation is here on the coastal plain. This is a transect across the coastal plain from, the Piedmont all the way to the shelf edge. And here's Hope Plantation in the middle. And Hatteras core is this nice 3,000 meter deep section across the whole thing that even tags the Jurassic base. Unfortunately, it was not continuously cored. They took a 10-foot core every 100 feet, but that's way better than nothing. So we're working on that right now to see what's there. But I think eventually we really need to drill some new cores in this area. So that's something longer term that I'm thinking about as well. And of course, more broadly, we need more shelf sites around the world because again, it's great if we can start filling in this stuff, but the whole western margin of South America, the western U.S., we got one sample right there. Eastern Asia, we got one sample, one core up here for all of East Asia. There's 2 sites on the margins of Australia, although I'm sure this was 2018, this was published, so I'm sure that's been improved since. But overall, we need a lot more marginal sites, a lot more shelf sites for OE2 across the world. We can better understand this event. With that, I'll say thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris, for a really, really awesome talk. So quick reminder, if anyone would like to send any questions through to us, you can do so using the questions at eoPERCS chat function on the box. So we have a few questions in. So first one, you've presented a great data set from North America. If you could pick one big region to look at next, which location/region would you go to and why?
I think Western South America would be a great place to look. That's a place that today there's big oxygen minimum zone development. There's a lot of upwelling, high productivity area. I would expect, and I haven't looked too much at Southern Pacific, Mid-Cretaceous paleoceanography, but I would expect that it was similar in the Cretaceous as it is today. And that seems to me to be a kind of the lowest hanging fruit, or maybe not the lowest hanging, but maybe the ripest fruit that we could pick to look at for better constraining, marginal ocean TOC development and oxia in these periods of time. Also trying to find, where all the black shale, where all the organic carbon was buried. I didn't talk about this in the talk, but one of the takeaways of Jeremy's paper looking at organic carbon mass accumulation rates through the Cretaceous is that actually, if you plot all that out and you extrapolate from the 13% that we know to the rest of the ocean, and then you look at what you expect to see buried based on the carbon isotope excursion, we're actually missing quite a bit of organic carbon, in quotes, organic carbon burial based on that model. So it suggests that there are some places that were actually exceeding their expected organic carbon burial at this time. And finding those would be really interesting. I would guess that Western and South America is one of them.
Cool. So we've got one in the chat. So hi, Chris. Thanks for a fantastic talk. The WIS extends much further north than just the US. Would extending your studies to Canadian sites add any value, or do you think the most interesting stuff is occurring near the mixing front? Incidentally, how well constrained is this mixing front? Does it move location dependent on sea level change?
Yes. So first of all, absolutely, I think we need a lot more sites from the Canadian part of the Western Interior. The central Western Interior in the U.S. is the part that's really been studied to death. And that connection up to the Arctic is less well constrained and probably extremely interesting. So yeah, I think that having more sites up there would be really helpful. Because almost all of our sites, we've got the western part of the central Western Interior Sea, but most of our sites are bathed in this Tethyan water mass. And so seeing what's going on in the northern part that's always under this boreal water mass would be very interesting. Also, the mixing front is kind of well constrained, but I think it could be much better constrained, and it's certainly moved based on circulation changes and sea level changes throughout the Cretaceous, or at least the part of the Cretaceous that the Western interior was flooded. I think we're well overdue for a new modeling paper on Western Cretaceous paleoceanography. And I think that the position of the mixing front and how it changes would be a really interesting takeaway from that. We mostly track it based on people think they can track it based on percent carbonate, things like that, which certainly shifts through time.
Nice. So are there any regions similar to yours where your interpretations match?
A good question. I haven't looked a whole lot at other shelf depth OEE2 sites across the world. Most of the ones I'm familiar with are deeper, like the Tunisian margin or Morocco. There's a lot of, Western Tethys, which is mostly deeper, but also isn't a true, even the shallower ones aren't a true continental shelf like you get in Eastern North America. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, and I'm sure y'all can jump in the chat and refresh my memory or tell me about new ones. But of just open shelf, middle shelf depth sites with OEE2 records, and on other margins, I can't really think of. Which I think really argues for we need a lot more of these.
Cool. So is it possible for refugee type benthic species that are looking for oxygen bottom, which are away from the OMZ and Anoxic deep water? Maybe I'll paste this one into the chat.
Sure. Okay. Is it possible for refugee type benthic species looking for oxygen bottom water away from the OMZ deep water to move towards the coastal plain? Probably. Although, if you look at the benthics that are coastal plain that we find in these shelf environments, they're the typical crew that you find in a lot of marginal marine environments throughout the Cretaceous. Neobolemina, Gavilanella, Planulina, very similar actually to the Western interior in these sites. So I'm not sure that if you're a shelf species looking to escape the oxygen minimum zone, I'm not sure if you go up or if you go down. Because a lot of bathyal, like middle shelf, slope, middle slope species and deeper have depth ranges that extend, well deep into the abyss. And so it's probably easier for those species to go down slope a little bit and get out of the OMZ than it would for them to go all the way up the slope and onto the shelf to escape the OMZ. I don't see any Refugio from deeper waters in these sites.
Nice. So we have another one in the chat. Is the faunal composition of the benthics of importance for your analysis?
I go back and forth on looking at the types of benthic species that are in there because there's a lot of discussion about infaunal versus epifaunal benthics, and certain species like Gavilanella or Neobolemina being indicative of low oxygen environments. But there's also a school of thought that I think I subscribe a bit more to, where if you look at modern benthic foraminifera based on their morphologies and assign them a depth habitat, or not a depth habitat, rather a microhabitat up on the seafloor, so epifaunal versus infaunal, you're only right about 75% of the time. And that's in a modern ocean where, things are relatively oxygenated and quote unquote normal. And so how those things might change in the Cretaceous, where you have lots of anoxia, you have a much different organic carbon flux to the seafloor. I'm less confident in using those associations to try to get at these changes. I think the simplest proxies are the best for these sort of things. And so if you just look at the percentage of benthics that are there, then that to me is safer ground, really, to kind of say there's more benthics here and there's less benthics here. And that is telling us, or even better, there's benthics here and there's no benthics. I feel better about that than looking at species. Also, as I mentioned, the species are actually pretty consistent across all these sites. Like I said, it's Neobolomina, it's Gavonella, it's Planulina, Lenticulina, kind of the general shelf assemblages. And you see some changes in abundance of them, but I'm not sure how much hay I would make out of that.
So we have another one through. Thank you very much for the lecture. Interesting topic. Could your interpretation be supplemented with increased continental weathering? I understand that you have strong marine fast sheet changes, but some things you mentioned can also be explained, for example, with an increase in weathering on plants on land.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Like that's what we're seeing is an increase in weathering on land. So increased Trigonous flux. So if you have more precipitation causing more weathering, you would see more land plant material coming out. Something that'd be interesting to look at in a lot of these sites that I haven't had a chance to do yet is clay mineralogy, because you would expect that to also track precipitation and Trigonous flux. It track more precipitation changes. And so if it is precipitation driving higher Trigonous flux, you'd expect to see a shift to wetter clay minerals, right? There's been a lot of this work that's been done in the Western Interior Sea, where you see changes in kaolinite versus smectite versus illite. And in the Western Interior Sea, it's tricky because you're saying, okay, well, is this because of local precipitation changes here, or is it changes in circulation of the seaway bringing more clay minerals from the north or the south? So on a place where you don't have estuarine circulation, like on an open shelf, I think that clay mineralogy would definitely be a way to supplement these analyses to help test this hypothesis. Absolutely.
Nice. Okay, so we don't have any more questions. So I will thank you again for doing a really, really awesome talk. And take over the screen share for me just to do a quick outro.
Yep.
So hopefully everybody can see this now. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this week at eoPERCS. Please fill out our weekly feedback form, and the link will be in the chat for this shortly, so that we can learn a bit more about who attended today. And join us next week at 3 p.m. UTC to hear Ornella Bertrand from the University of Edinburgh in the UK to talk about the impacts of environmental changes on the brain evolution of rodents and early placental mammals. So up next, we have Tea Time with Chris. So why stay? You can learn more about today's speaker, their research path, and the work that they do. Meet new friends or bump into old ones, discuss the talk with paleo fans of different backgrounds, or just unwind with a chat before heading back to your regularly scheduled day. So we have a quick 2-minute timer to have a quick break. So get up, walk around, have a drink of water, and come back in 2 minutes. And if you have eoPERCS, they are always very welcome to our tea time. See you in 2 minutes.